Now, this 90-day freedom test is not about escaping your reality overnight. It's actually something you have to measure, because you can't be an architect of what you won't face. A performer would ask, what do I need to do today? But then an architect will ask, what do I need to build this year so that next year looks fundamentally different from what this year looks like? Think about it. Why do we stay broke? It's because oftentimes we are trying to compete with people we don't even like. We buy things we don't need with money we don't have to impress people we don't like. I want to ask you something, and I want you to think about it before we move on. Now, if you disappeared for 90 days, no calls, no emails, no check-ins, what happens to your life? Previously, we talked about how your environment is your operating system. And if the operating system is weak, everything glitches. But if it is strong, everything runs smoother. But here's the part we didn't touch deeply enough. Even with a strong environment, what exactly is running on it? Now, here's the real question. If you disappeared for 90 days, that's 3 months, does your income keep coming? Do your systems keep running? Do your commitments hold? Does anything really move forward without you? Or does everything stop the moment you stop showing up? So I'd like you to just sit with that for a second. I think for most people, if they are honest, they already know the answer. And it's kind of uncomfortable, not because they're failing, but because nobody ever walked them through the difference between producing a life, and building a life. And today, that's exactly what I'd like us to focus on. Welcome to the Future Foundations podcast. Today, we are going to run a simple but uncomfortable test, and I call it the 90-day freedom test. We talk a lot about wealth on the internet, and it usually looks like buying Ferraris or going on Dubai trips. But let's bring it down to earth. Real wealth is the ability to sleep at night. I'm not here to talk about passive income fantasies or escaping responsibility. This episode actually is about diagnosing the architecture of your life. Whether you're employed, self employed, running a business, or building on the side, the question remains the same. Are you building something that can stand without you, or are you just performing something that collapses the moment you step away? Now, there's a concept I keep coming back to whenever I talk about life's architecture with other people, and it's a very simple concept, but I think most of us have never really framed it this way. There are two types of lives: the life you produce and the life that produces. Most of us are trained from school, from society, from watching our parents to produce, to show up, do the work, and get paid. We repeat, right? The moment you stop showing up, you stop getting paid. That's the model. And of course, that model really works. It feeds you and it stabilizes you. I've lived that model too. In fact, when I first moved to Europe, everything was about performance, prove values, stay useful, stay relevant, keep the momentum. And honestly, there's nothing wrong with that season. But at some point, I had to ask myself a harder question. If I stop performing today, does anything I've built keep working? Because there's a difference between earning through effort and creating something that keeps moving, that keeps earning beyond effort. Now, the problem is not the model itself, because employment is not the enemy. A salary is not a trap. There only becomes a problem when that's the only gear you have. When your entire life architecture is built on a single point of failure, you showing up every single day. The truth is, if you're an employee or if you're an immigrant working 2 jobs, supporting family back home, I want you to understand one thing. You are a business. You are UINC. But right now, your business has a major risk. It has only one customer, and that's your boss. And if that customer fires you today, your business goes bankrupt. I want you to understand that it is not an employee versus entrepreneur conversation. But then I know employees who are building long term leverage quietly. And I know business owners who can't step away for 3 days without their business turning into total chaos. So that label actually doesn't really matter here. What matters is this: Are you maintaining your current position, or are you gradually reducing how dependent your life is on your daily presence? That's actually the test. Think about it in terms of systems, right? If you have a system with one critical component and that component fails, then it means the whole system has failed. Engineers actually call this the single point of failure, and it's considered the most dangerous design flaw in any system can have. And yet, most people have structured their lives entirely this way. You are the single point of failure in your own life systems. Now, this 90-day freedom test I'm talking about is not about escaping your reality overnight. It's actually something you have to measure, because you can't be an architect of what you won't face. I want to introduce a common framing here that I think is more useful than the usual employee versus entrepreneur conversation, which we might commonly hear on the internet. And of course, in my opinion, this creates a false binary. It makes it sound like you have to choose a side, but ideally you really don't. You really don't need to choose a side. The real difference lies between having a performer mindset and an architect mindset. And you can hold an architect mindset while fully being employed. In fact, the most strategically positioned people I've studied do exactly that. A performer would ask, what do I need to do today? But then an architect will ask, what do I need to build this year so that next year looks fundamentally different from what this year looks like? A performer trades time for outcomes, but an architect builds systems that generate value whether or not they are physically present. A performer has one stream and one dependency. An architect treats their life, career, finances, relationship, health as a portfolio of internal designed choices. I shared a story about Anthony, who today runs a massive financial services group. That's the guy who grew up partly in a zinc shack. He talks about how poverty leaves a trauma, a quote that tells you life is hard. But then he also talks about something really, really powerful. He says, poverty builds an innate sense of fear of ever going back there. And that fear to me is fuel. In fact, if you're starting from zero today, or if you're in survival mode, do not be ashamed. The only thing you need right now is the drive to say, this is my starting point and not my ending point. And so, through this 90-day freedom test, which I'm going to introduce to you, we are asking the question, how much of an architect have you actually become? Not in theory, not in aspiration, in your actual bank accounts or your actual calendar, your actual life structure. How much of an architect are you right now? I know you may be wondering, why 90 days specifically? And to me, it's because 90 days is long enough. It's long enough that you can't fake it. In a month, you can rely on maybe goodwill and momentum. But in 3 months, the structural reality of how your life actually works becomes visible. It's also the minimum unit of time that reveals whether you've built systems or just routines. A lot of people have side projects, consulting gigs, or businesses they think are building something. Well, some of them really are building something, but many have just traded one dependency for another, and they've added complexity without adding freedom. 90 days to me is the truth serum, it's the actual reveal. In discussing this 90-day freedom test, I want to walk you through what I call the freedom scorecard. I'll walk you through 5 dimensions, and I want you to score yourself as we go through each one of them. There's a framework, and if you're somewhere you can write, please write it down. The first dimension of this 90-day freedom test is your income architecture. And the question here is not how much you make, but it's about how you make it, how it's structured. If you have one client, one employer, one revenue stream, I mean, if one employer or one client makes up your income, you have maximum exposure. That's simple math, right? One relationship, one contract, one decision by someone else, and your income disappears. That's one point. If you have 2 or 3 income streams, but all of them require your constant attention or daily involvement, I think you're less exposed here, but still you've not yet built leverage. So here you can score yourself 2 or 3 points. But then if you have multiple streams of which at least one generates income without your daily involvement, say something like a product, a retainer, recurring revenue agreements, systems that run without you, documented processes which someone else can execute, then you can easily score yourself a 4 or 5. Here's what I want you to sit with when we talk about this income architecture. Recurring revenue isn't just a business model, it's a life strategy. The difference between someone who charges per project and someone who builds retainers or systems is not just cash flow, it's compound time. Every month, you're not reselling from scratch, you're reinvesting that time into the next layer of your architecture. Most people in the building phases are so focused on generating income that they never stop to architect it. They keep filling the bucket without ever fixing the leak. The question isn't just, are you making money? The question is the way you make money building towards something or just sustaining something? I remember when I stopped chasing more money and started asking, how do I make this repeat? The single shift changed how I priced, how I negotiated, and how I built relationships. So we see that repetition creates breathing room, and breathing room creates strategy. The second dimension is location. I know I talk about this a lot, but this is not about whether you should move cities or countries. It's about understanding your geographic dependencies. The question here is, what breaks if you change your physical location for those 3 months? Your income, your network, your workflow. If your income or your relationships or your daily operations require your physical presence in one specific place, say a specific office or a specific city, or certain in-person dependencies that haven't been systemized, it means your location is a constraint which you're probably not pricing into your decisions. And I want to be very frank here. Even if you're in a role that requires your physical presence, are you building something alongside that doesn't require that presence? Are you developing skills, relationships, or income streams that are not geographically locked? If you remember, we already talked about your environment being your operating system. And as a complement here, location dependence is not just about what your environment is doing to you, it's more about how dependent you are on that environment. I've lived in different systems now, different countries, different rules. And one thing becomes very clear when you move enough. You need to be remote, but you should be developing skills and relationships that also travel with you. Now, if you score high points on this dimension, it doesn't mean you work remotely or you travel constantly. It simply means you have options. I like to talk about having options. It means your value is not so entangled with one location or one geography that a single change would easily unravel your life. Options are power, even if you never use them. Now, the third dimension is time leverage. And this one is usually the one that hits hardest. The metric I want you to think about here is your leverage ratio. For every hour you personally work, how much value is being generated? In a pure time for money model, the ratio is a 1-to-1. You work 1 hour, you generate 1 hour of value. And that's really the ceiling. You cannot exceed it without breaking yourself. Now compare that to a system where your 1 hour of work creates a system, a product, or a process that generates value for, say, 100 hours after you've moved on. The ratio changes completely. That means you've broken the 1-to-1 constraint. Here's the uncomfortable thing about leverage. Leverage starts small. Almost nobody builds it intentionally. Most people usually stumble into it or they hear about it and think it sounds good, but they never sit down to ask, where in my current work is the potential that I'm not capturing? Because leverage is not always about starting a company or writing a bestseller. Sometimes it's as simple as documenting something once, so you never have to explain it 5 times. In other words, documenting a process so someone else can execute what you've already built. Sometimes leverage is packaging what you already know, packaging expertise you already have into something deliverable without you being present. Trust me, leverage is rarely glamorous. It's usually very boring. And if you don't deliberately create leverage, you always feel busy but never free. The fourth dimension, financial resilience. Now, this is quite different from income, which we mentioned before as our first dimension. But here we're talking about the structural cushion underneath your income. In a previous episode, we talked about having 3 to 6 months of living expenses saved, and that's the runway. But financial freedom, in a more durable sense, requires more than a runway. It requires what I'd like to call resilience architecture. Now, resilience architecture means when something breaks, what catches you? What's your fallback? Most people, if they map this honestly, most people have very few safety nets. Their income stops, their savings last 3 months, and then the pressure to accept any income, any kind of income, or any kind of terms becomes very overwhelming. And that pressure is where bad decisions get made, bad partnerships, bad contracts, underpricing, overcommitting. You see, pressure changes how you negotiate, it changes how you tolerate, and it also changes who you say yes to. So a financial cushion allows you to take the time to think clearly. One of the structural advantages of having capital is that you can afford to wait for the right opportunity. You can walk away from a bad situation. The person without financial resilience cannot do any of those things. They are negotiating from necessity, and necessity produces suboptimal outcomes every single time. So when I ask about financial resilience in this scorecard, I'm asking, are you building the structural conditions that allow you to make decisions from choice rather than desperation? When you're not desperate, you make better choices, and better decisions compound. The runway is a start, but the goal is to build enough resilience that the quality of your life, of your decisions, never degrades under financial pressure. The fifth and final dimension, which I love very much, is relationships. And this might be the most under-discussed aspect of building a sustainable free life. The question here is, where is your life dependent on individual relationships that are fragile? And what I mean is this: if 70% of your income comes from one client, and that client relationship is based on one person that you know personally, not a contract, not a system, not an institution, then it means your income is as stable as that one person's mood or that person's health, and that is continued employment. That's not a business. That's a very stressful friendship. Have you converted key relationships into something more durable? A contract instead of a handshake, an institutional relationship instead of a personal relationship, or a documented system instead of knowledge that lives in someone's head? And then on a personal level, are your personal relationships built to support a life that grows? Are the people around you aligned with growth, or are you surrounded by people who are only attached to you or attached to the version of you which they are very comfortable with? Now, these questions actually require some level of maturity to answer. So, like I said, these are dimensions. These are things we can actually measure. And so, if you've already scored yourself across these 5 dimensions, I want to talk about what to do with that, because most frameworks usually get this wrong. Most frameworks usually say if you have a low score, then they give you an action plan. And of course, that's useful. But then I think the more important thing is to understand which type of gap, where your gap actually is, because they require complete a completely different response. And so we are going to walk through 3 different gaps. The first type of gap is the capacity gap. This is where you understand what needs to be built, know how to build it, but then the issue is simply that you have not built it yet. You're too busy producing and not architecting, and you don't have the time. You don't have time. You're constantly reacting. The solution is for you to carve out protected time consistently so that you can work on the architecture. Say, for example, you take 2 hours a week, deliberately investing in building one weak area of your life or one of the dimensions we just talked about. And that's going to help you compound over 12 months into something genuinely different from what you have now. The enemy of the capacity gap is the endless urgency of the present. The client who needs something today, the crisis that feels like it matters, all of it is real. But if you let the present consume every hour, you look up in 3 years and you realize that your architecture will be identical to what you have right now. The second gap is the knowledge gap. You don't yet know how to build what needs to be built. You have a structured retainer. You don't know how to systematize your work. You've never thought about what leveraged income even looks like in your field. The good news is, this is actually the easiest gap to close because information is everywhere. But the issue is that most people don't even know what specific knowledge they are missing, so they tend to consume generic content from everywhere and they never move forward. If you are in a knowledge gap, the prescription for you is precision. Identify the one dimension where you scored the lowest from what we already discussed. Name the specific thing you don't know how to do, and then go find the answer to that specific question. You have to ask very specific questions, precise questions, not things like how do I become successful, or not going to look for a course on entrepreneurship or a book on mindset. It should be more like how do I convert this type of work into recurring revenue? And if you ask this kind of question, you get a precise answer to a specific question. Specific questions get specific answers. Third type of gap is actually the hardest, and it's the identity gap. This is where you know what to build, you have the knowledge to build it, but you're hesitating. There is something that keeps pulling you back to what you're normally familiar with. So you start, you get close, then you stop, you rationalize. The identity gap is where most people spend their entire lives without realizing it. I've also experienced that myself, especially when stepping into rooms or making decisions that require a bigger version of me. This is not a skills problem, and it's not even a strategy problem. The actual problem is that the version of yourself which builds the architecture you're describing doesn't feel like you yet. You can't think yourself out of the identity gap. You have to build your way out of it. You need to take the action that a new version of you would take before you even feel like that person. You make the decision, you have the conversation, you build a system, and you do it consistently enough that your self concept starts to catch up with your behavior. I'm not going to pretend that it's easy, but then I won't also pretend that it requires a personal transplant. It actually requires clarity, consistency, and usually new inputs. I talked about this when I talked about your environment being your operating system. If the people around you only know one version of you, they'll continuously and unconsciously pull you back towards that version. Think about it. Why do we stay broke? It's because oftentimes we are trying to compete with people we don't even like. We buy things we don't need with money we don't have to impress people we don't like. If you're an employee earning a decent salary, but then you have zero savings, that means you're working poor. You're wearing what I call the golden handcuffs. We need to stop trying to look rich and start trying to be safe. The first step of a builder is to create a gap between what you earn and what you spend. I don't care if you earn $500 a month or $50,000 a month. If you spend it all, you're a slave to the system. You have to fight for your margin. By the way, if you're an immigrant, you might feel disadvantaged because you don't have, say, the right passport or maybe the right accent in the environment where you are. But you have something which the locals often lack, and that's hunger. Let me zoom out for a moment here before we close, before we wrap up, because everything we've talked about today exists inside a large frame, which I always talk about, and that frame is legacy. I use the word legacy deliberately, and I use it to mean something very, very specific. And again, legacy in the context of this show means what does your life produce that outlasts your active participation in it? That's the real question. That's the real answer to the 90-day question. What I expect is for you to ask, am I building something that has weight and continuity beyond my daily efforts? Am I building something that a future version of me or my children or the people I want to impact will be able to stand on? Because here's what I've observed in people who build real durable lives. And I want to be careful here not to refer to the social media type of success. I'm talking about people who genuinely build something lasting and stay there. At some point, they stopped building for this year and they started building for the next decade. And it's not like they abandoned short term thinking. Of course, you have to sustain yourself, but because they held both time frames simultaneously, they made short term decisions that were consistent with long term architecture. They handle their today, but at the same time, they are also shaping the next year and the year after. 90-day freedom test is a short term diagnostic, but what it's actually measuring is a long term question. And that question is, are the decisions you're making today compounding towards something, or are they just sustaining you right now? Are you building something that gets stronger over time, or are you rebuilding the same month over and over? Now, there's a version of this discussion that often gets romanticized, and that involves passive income or financial independence, whatever the current framing is. And I don't want to dismiss those concepts, but I'd really like to strip away the romance and offer you the operational version. Building life architecture is not glamorous at all. It's documenting processes, it's having hard conversations about value and pricing. It's saying no to short term opportunities that don't move your architecture forward. It's about choosing the recurring relationships over one off transactions. It's about building systems instead of redoing work which you've already done several times before. None of that is glamorous, but if you compound that over, say, 5 years, it becomes transformative. This week, just like every other week, I want to leave you with one concrete move. And that move is this: do your 90-day audit. Actually sit down and write this out. Score yourself across these 5 dimensions which I mentioned: income architecture, geographic flexibility, time leverage, financial resilience, and relationship independence. Then pick one area out of these 5 dimensions, most probably the one where you're most vulnerable, and ask the question, what is the smallest improvement I can make in the next 30 days that will reduce my total exposure? The smallest structural shift. You need to understand that structure compounds, but intensity burns out. I'll put the Freedom Scorecard as a downloadable worksheet in the description. You can walk through it, fill it in, and share your results if you're comfortable. And by the way, I appreciate the engagement and the questions I get, and hopefully sometime soon I'll be able to start answering the ones that are most useful to the most people. If you have questions or something you'd like to share concerning any of our discussions, please feel free to let us know through any means possible. And in the coming weeks, I still plan to discuss more interesting topics in relation to building value, building skills, systems, and of course, your positioning. But for now, please do the audit. If you disappeared for 90 days, what is left? That's it. That's the work you need to do. This is Future Foundations. Let's build beyond borders together.